first couple of sessions. Convergence, making it happen. We have 4 people who are part of making it happen, together with many people in the audience, shall I say. Introduce maybe with 5-10 minutes, something like that, and then try to open up for a broader discussion. I won't introduce you. You know it's on the agenda there. You might want to say a few words yourselves to introduce yourselves. You can probably do it better than I can. So 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll follow the order here. Fabiana, if you would like to say a few words, please.
I'm Fabiana Pierini. I work in DG Employment, the European Commission. I'm a team leader for the social dimension of EMU, something which could be quite empty or full, depending from the point of view. Complicated, but there are a lot of things on macroeconomic labor market issues, notably. I think I'm here because my director is not there, so apologize for trying to be there, but maybe not too much political, because maybe I cannot too much. I was involved in the work on social pillar, so I have quite an overview of what is convergence, notably, and I work, in fact, within the social dimension of EMU on convergence especially. Yes. And also I would like to say in this context that, as a first thing, I'm quite proud of this work by the Euro Foundation, Eurofound, because when in 2016 we were working on the pillar, I was working on the pillar in task force, and people liaising with the Euro Foundation came to me and others asking what we would like the Euro Foundation to help us with. And I said they should help us with convergence, because we look for convergence in the pillar. We don't know how to conceptualize it. We don't know what we want to look at and what is the long-term trends. We need really someone to help us. And it was then a great thing that the Euro Foundation accepted to do that job. And we see the results. Everything is going to go on with the more in-depth and insightful findings. And I think this is also thanks really to the Juncker Commission, which has been really a game changer in the sense that before then we were looking really much in macroeconomic and overall economic trends, and the economic was really at the core. With the crisis, Juncker had no choice but to really put the same for economic and social, and social policy really at the top of the priorities. This, I think, was clear at the time. 2 things. First, we cannot avoid anymore to put in practice this social investment paradigm, which was in 2013 communication. That was there, but was not really taken up. We needed to put it in practice. So we realized that investing in people is key to supporting growth, which is sustainable, fairness, and therefore socio-economic convergence. And at the same time, linked to this, they need to push for structural reforms. But what kind of structural reforms? What Plamen was saying this morning, 2.0 structural reforms, which put together fairness, sustainability, and efficiency. Now the issue is that, so this is what we do, what we've done since 2015 with the social pillar, in fact, as a strong political instrument, really, at a political level, gathering all together and bottom-up encompassing approach to this kind of socio-economic convergence. Now the issue is how to do with fairness, what that means. You know that the pillar we have, because of this high level but yet very, very clear set of rights and principles, we have different policy instruments to put it in practice. This is really what makes it really very strong, maybe. So this is the joint commitment by all actors, including national and European level, because the idea is that we have to have rights in practice. We need to have institutions which work. This is a national level or even regional and local level. That's why, besides EU instruments that we move forward proposals like the Directive on Transparent Predictable Working Conditions and so on, the key focus is on the semester and on linking the EU budget with the policy making, even more for the next multi-annual financial framework, and with the instruments such that the budgetary instrument for convergent competitiveness and our reform support program before that. So this is really key, the link with our support to investment reforms, which make a difference in reforms 2.0, and how to do to make the semester clearly attached, linked to these fairness considerations. We have different elements. You have the rural dimensions in the rural recommendation, which includes a lot on the pillar inside to the structural reforms and labor market there, and the social considerations. But also we have the new tools, one on which Earth Foundation works, which is to look at convergence, which is a social scoreboard, and then so to see the outcomes. Another tool which is we actually a lot working on it with the committees, with the EMCO and SPC, which is benchmarking as well. What we do there with the idea is that if you want to have convergence in the policy outcomes, okay, there is market, but there is also institutions make the difference. And there, there are some elements of institutions on the labor market and social policy field on our side, on which you can support some form of convergence to go towards well-functioning and fair labor market and welfare systems, which are the core and social pillar. So we are working on these benchmarking frameworks, which are in the employment social field, just because the 5 Presidents report was so strong about that, and it was taken up by the social pillar communication with a clear indication benchmarking a preferred tool for convergence in policy settings. And we have worked on, already agreed with the member states in committee on benchmarking in unemployment benefits and elective market policies, on minimum income schemes and adult learn and skills. Yes, I'm going to finish. This is interesting because besides you said the little results, this is very important because with member states we reach common understanding of our reform needs, of what we mean by these institutions and what to converge together towards, and monitoring progress over time. So this takes time, but it's really relevant. You're working on other areas, including trying to map collective bargaining function. It is really complicated. We are going to ask the help of social parents about that, to have some informal consult, user expertise, to better understand institutions. So based on these three elements, so that we have to, so institutions make a difference. So one question is, we have to prone for convergence in institutions. We see also the stabilization function, which is behind and as a benefit from convergence, but to what extent we could converge, on what we should converge in institutions. So this is not evident. It's not easy. The role of regional background is key. The divergences now we see more than ever. We are converging with member states, but the divergences within countries are even increasing, even stronger within sometimes than between countries. We have developed a regional breakdown of the social scoreboard, which is now being published, I think, already, for I think some 8 or 10 of the 14 indicators of the social scoreboard in the Joint Research Center website and in the Eurostat website. So this is a way to see and to be able to have a common understanding of the issues where they are for the key outcome indicators. And finally, looking forward convergence, not only backward, what sort of play where we are now, but how to avoid further divergences, what are the key issues to work on. Then is, of course, human capital, but you also adapting social protection systems, how to avoid precarious jobs and new forms of work. And there, I think, again, the work of European Foundation is really relevant. If you look at convergence in the 2 surveys you run, which is the quality of life survey and the working conditions survey, which is really fantastic. You have no information about that. It will be ground for understanding what fairness means, and then having policy guidance afterwards.
Thank you very much indeed. Eric, please.
Thank you, Donald. I fear that I will not have the answer how to make convergence happen. But first, I obviously would also like to thank Eurofound for, I think, a very timely and interesting report. We in DG Regio are obviously interested, and this has already been mentioned a couple of times, at subnational disparities. And indeed, the trend which we see is rather worrying. What we see is that both in more developed member states, think about Italy, think about Spain, think about France or so, disparities are increasing internally, but we also see it in the less developed member states like Poland, Bulgaria, Romania. Now, when you take a closer look, then you see that the patterns at work are different. It's not that like the same trend is happening in both places. What we see in the less developed member states is that both the capital regions as well as, let's say, the lagging regions, which we usually call low-income regions in DG Regio, they are both growing growing compared to the EU average. But in fact, the capital regions usually grow much, much faster, so that the internal disparity between usually the capital or the big metropolitan area and the rest of the country is increasing quite quickly. And while we see that indeed also in, let's say, the lagging behind regions in the less developed member states, they are growing, we see some alarming signs, which is, for example, obviously a lot of outward migration, in particular of the young and the educated. They go to the capitals where, like jobs are concentrated, where innovation is concentrated, where higher incomes can be earned. We also see, and this is an issue which has also been probably already touched upon, that the quality of government, and I'm thinking here in particular about public institutions, but also the business environment also is a concern. We have, in fact, and this is true for both the less developed member states and the more developed member states, we have worked together with the World Bank on the ease of doing business. And we went subnational because we wanted to see, well, how is the situation in practice when you go below the national level? And in principle, you would think there is no reason why the situation should be different because the rules are the same. I mean, it's not that, the rules in terms of the business environment are different from northern Italy to the south of Italy. But the practice is quite significant. And we just, for example, I give you two examples. For example, in Spain, when you look at the region of Valencia, it takes you around 100 days to set up to get a construction permit. And the same, in fact, in the region around Vigo takes you more than 300 days. And this is just due to the fact that the administration is not as well performing here like it is there. And we also did the same exercise in Poland, for example. There, for example, to set up a company, it takes you 10 days in the region around Poznan, while it takes you more than 40 days in the region of Szczecin. So once again, there are no different rules at work here. It's just that the institutions or the administrations are not performing equally well in different places. So this is what we see about, let's say, less developed member states in particular. In the more developed member states, our concern are the so-called low-growth regions. So these are regions which have a bit of a higher income, but which are not really productive, which are competing with low-cost locations either within the EU or outside the EU, and which have difficulties to move to higher value-added activities because they are not able, for example, to absorb new technologies or digitalization or globalization. So we see that they seem to be somehow stuck in what we call a middle income trap and have difficulties to move on. So once again, so we see different types and categories of regions, but we see in fact that these kind of unfortunate diverging trends are at work. And what I would highly recommend to all of you is we have made some work which is called the geography of discontent. It's a study which we have published a year ago. And basically what we looked there is how are the voting patterns in particular vis-a-vis the EU. And what you see are that the people living in places which we would probably label as left behind, or at least they have the impression that they are left behind, are much more critical vis-a-vis the European project and vote much more often in favor of, let's say, nationalist or populist parties than those which are better off. So we see that this leads to tensions, it leads to discontent, and we think we obviously need to do something about it. If I may just add one more thing, because probably this has not been mentioned, but I think the biggest challenge ahead for us right now, and this you can also find in the political guidelines of the Commission President-elect, is in fact the challenge to transform this continent into a carbon-neutral continent by 2050. And I just want to share with you two figures which show you the magnitude of the challenge which is ahead of us. So you probably know that the EU has committed itself by 2020, so which means next year, to reduce carbon emissions as compared to 1990 by 20%. We will reach this target. We are, I think, already at 21%. But it took us 30 years. We had an economic crisis in between, which kind of contributed to, well, the reduction of economic activities and also then obviously reduction of CO2 emissions. And we had probably also benefited from many of the most polluting industrial facilities in Central and Eastern Europe being shut down over the last 10 years. Now we are supposed to go to at least 40%. This is the current objective. And Mrs. von der Leyen has said by 2030 we should even go reduce by 50% or more the CO2 emissions. This basically means that on an annual basis we would need to reduce CO2 emissions 3 times faster than what we have achieved so far over the next 10 years. So this is a gigantic task. And in fact, when you think about how our economic model functions, where transport, but also heating, electricity production, industrial process are largely based on carbon, it shows you, like what the task ahead of us is. And once again, this brings me back, why does this matter? Well, it matters because when you just look around, you see that not all the places, not all the regions are equally prepared for this enormous transition. We have still 250,000 people working in coal mining. These people don't have a future. They need to find new opportunities, new job opportunities. They probably will need to be retrained because clearly coal is on its way out. I mean, we are going to phase out from coal. Just to illustrate one concrete example where we need to make a transition, where clearly different regions will be differently affected, and where probably many regions will find it difficult to diversify, to modernize the economy and find new jobs for their citizens. Last word, so what are we supposed to do about this in order to make it happen? Well, I mean, one element is clearly investment. I think it has already been mentioned. And the Commission will put forward a quite substantial, the next Commission Sustainable Investment Plan. I think also reforms. I already referred to the business environment. I referred to public administrations need to improve, probably also many other sectors where we need reforms. And therefore, indeed, one of our approaches right now is to bring these different dimensions more closely together in the European semester to make sure that we have a more holistic view and look at all the different elements which are conducive but also decisive for this question, how do we make convergence happen? I think I stop here.
Thank you. James.
Thank you very much. I'm James Watson, Director of Economics at Business Europe. So first of all, I'd like to thank you very much, as other people have done, for an excellent report. I'd say in particular, I think it's an extremely balanced report. And I think importantly as well, I think it's an extremely well presented and accessible report. And that's probably something we can all learn from. Everywhere we go at the moment, of course, we hear about a crisis of capitalism. I think even the FT, as the Financial Times has run a series under that title. And so we hear politicians, and for example, Matthew's boss, Luca Vicentini, has said that the mainstream politicians in the last 10 years have overseen rising inequality and falling living standards. And we see other politicians make similar remarks. So I think it's a helpful reminder, this report really, that of course we need to continue to do more to ensure that prosperity is widely shared. And in particular, as Eric mentioned, make sure that it's more sustainable. Not everything is doom and gloom. And so the key finding of the report, I think, is important. Member states have converged towards better employment and social and economic conditions overall. We're all aware, of course, in this room of rising employment, falling unemployment. The report shows that there's also convergence within EU member states on that. But we're also seeing rising disposable incomes and convergence around that. And we're seeing, for example, falls in the gender gap, increasing convergence around that. And pretty much all the educational indicators are rising, and we're seeing convergence around those. But I think there's two important provisos that are in the report and that we've talked about today. The first is around convergence in the euro area, where we're clearly not seeing enough convergence in the euro area. How do we address that? I think we need to recognise that in a fixed exchange rate regime, you can no longer adjust through nominal exchange rate movements. So we need to see real changes in labour markets. We haven't seen enough of those to make them more adaptable to the EMU, to ensure that wages remain in line with competitiveness. We need to strengthen EMU itself. We need to complete the banking union. We also, I think, had a good discussion around stabilisation. And we talked in depth about an unemployment insurance scheme. What I'd say on that, first of all, Business Europe, we support a stabilisation function, but we support it through the investment protection scheme. We heard an analogy of the unemployment insurance scheme analogous to getting vaccinated. Of course, the issue with that is it's not quite analogous. You can't get vaccinated against unemployment. You can have your chances of catching unemployment reduced. And the problem is it brings up another issue of moral hazard, which is how people behave. So to come back to the vaccination issue, if people are sort of not fully vaccinated, but they're vaccinated a little bit, so they might not be quite as ill, then the risk is, of course, that they go around to places where they're likely to catch the illness because they're less worried about it. And so that's the analogy, I think, with the unemployment insurance scheme, where countries do have concerns about, they have moral hazard concerns that it might reduce incentives of countries to really put in place the schemes that we need to reduce unemployment. So stabilisation important, but we'd rather see it through the investment protection scheme. So that's the first proviso around the euro area. The second one, I think we've had a very good discussion of it today, is the within member state issue. And we discussed this morning that the issues around agglomeration and the new economy and such like. I'm not an expert on this, but I do recall in the UK there's been some research done where it basically looked at the issue, is this an issue of the place itself, or is it an issue of the people in the place? And essentially what the researchers do, they kind of they pretend that they've taken the people in certain places and put them somewhere else. And does that solve the issue? And what they find essentially is if you take people from poorer areas and put them in a prosperous place, they still don't do terribly well. Their essential findings are that it's really to do with the people and not to do with the place. It's primarily a skills issue. Okay, so I think that's the first thing we should bear in mind. I think there's a lot we can do through the skills system. I think you put up a colleague from ECFIN put up some interesting things about the sectoral changes, the importance of the sectoral changes. We also did some work in Business Europe where we looked, for example, at digital skills. There is a worrying trend. If you look in some of the member states have lower levels of income. They also have lower levels of digital skills. That's a danger for the future. So, I think there's a lot that we can do on the skills issue, thinking about the people as much as the place. You raised a point around, I was intrigued, you said that it was a dangerous, it was an alarming sign, the migration within the member states, you suggested. I do wonder whether that's entirely alarming. Surely we want to see some labour mobility. If we think about economic history, you had the Industrial Revolution, for example, and people would move to the places where the coal was or the iron ore. I think we do have to have some labour mobility reflecting new economic geography. It can't simply about saying that those places are where the people live, and we have to work on that basis. There does have to be labour mobility as one form of adjustment. So those two very important provisos. So there's also already some policy recommendations there. What do we do more generally? Well, I was interested by the quote from Mr. Van den Broek that's already in the report. I'd already read it in the report with interest, where he says that the founding fathers, he reminds us that the founding fathers of the EU believed that social convergence would arise through economic convergence. I think perhaps we can all reflect that this may not be spontaneous, it may need some help, but nevertheless, I think there's still an extremely important link. We've talked quite a lot about about risk of poverty. We're all aware that in-work poverty is around 9%, but I think we should also, or risk of poverty for those in work is around 9%. But we shouldn't forget that for the general population, that's 22%. I don't know if anybody's done the calculations. I think it would be extremely helpful, and I think it would be more balanced if there was a calculation that looked at the risk of poverty for a household where you're out of work. But obviously, given most households, given the unemployment numbers, most households won't have everybody out of work. I think you're likely to see that it's going to be significantly higher, much more than that 9-22 split. And so the important message really is that the best way to reduce poverty, the most efficient way is through ensuring people have a job. We have the European semester that can work on employment. It can also work on productivity, so that we raise people's productivities. That's another way to address that in-work poverty. So we can raise people's wages sustainable. And I think there is a danger. I mean, I know the van der Leyen mission lesson has talked about integrating the Sustainable Development Goals, okay, but we need to make sure that that semester remains focused. If you target everything, you target nothing. We do have an issue at the moment in terms of implementation. Business Europe, we think it's around 20% of the country-specific recommendations are implemented satisfactorily. I know other institutions say it's a little bit higher, but I think there's a general agreement that implementation is too low. So we need to make sure that that semester remains focused around the key economic and employment objectives, and that we have good implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Mathieu.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm going to repeat all what my colleague said before, but and I said it to Massimiliano when we spoke last week on the phone. It's really welcome to have some work devoted fully to economic and social convergence. Indeed, if I'm doing just a little bit of history, we had in mind, or it seems that it was a story which was going on at the beginning of the European Union, that the market would solve the solution, that we would converge through the market. So at the end, it's not the case. At least we converged, but at a cost. And the cost is huge imbalances. And as our colleague just said before, if we are going to the micro level, huge polarization on a geographical basis. And just also for you to know, the ETUC Congress took place in May, and upward convergence is very much on the top priority of the ETUC. So really, it's really on time. It cannot be better for that. But however, it's a very tricky, large, complex issue to speak about convergence. As James just said before, we can target everything or not. We can target about happiness, social satisfaction, job satisfaction, economic satisfaction. So it's not difficult. Here, I will try to focus more. I will try not to focus on facts and figures, since a lot of facts and figures already were presented this morning, and already by our colleague. However, listening to the few interventions we had this morning, I think that perhaps we have even to go beyond social and economic convergence and make politics fully entering into the debate. Why? Because, and I think also the Commission took this also into account when specifying that we should stop what the label did this way. And so I'm just repeating what the Commission is saying about itself, that they used to work too much in silos. And so now it seems that indeed convergence or green transition needs to have much more complementarity within the European Commission, different directorates, and I think it's welcome. So the first debate, as I said before, it was unsustainable. The Juncker plan in this respect was also very much market-based. And when we had the first assessment of the Juncker plan, it was say, look, it's geographically imbalanced. The richest member states are receiving the largest funds. So after that, the Commission and the EIB tried to manipulate a little bit the figures to show that if you count by population or by GDP, then it's more balanced. However, there is a strong request for saying, look, if we are speaking about convergence, we have to pick the member states, the regions where we need to catch up. And this is a political process. And this means transfers. And we are in the European Union. It's a word which has not been said this morning. So we are in a transfer union. But let me say that perhaps we should think about enlarging a transfer union, making more transfer and having a much larger EU budget for helping is a bad word, but for financing some needs for convergence in different member states and regions. At least, and therefore the next plan for the InvestEU needs to take this into account. If we just count on market-driven wishing for developing the European Union, it's not going to be enough, as we saw it in the last 10 or 15 years. But also, I think before speaking about convergence, we should make clear something very clear to European citizens and to European political leaders. If you want to be better off, it cannot be outside of the European Union. You cannot leave the European Union if you want to be better off. If you want these to be taken seriously, and now I'm back to what James said, we need some kind of European fiscal capacity. We need some kind of European indebtedness. Commit the way you want. You can call it European Debt Agency, you can call it a European fiscal stability for protecting public investment, you can call it a European unemployment reinsurance mechanism, etc. But we need a European asset. We need a European asset which makes the link between our currency and our central bank. Because right now we are dealing with a foreign currency. And some member states, for economic reasons, can go on default. If they have the possibility to go on default, then you'll have some citizens who will say, look, we will be much better afterwards when we'll be out of the European Union. And it was also mentioned by a colleague to have, and it will prevent some kind of completely crazy nationalistic wishes. If there are some good nationalistic wishes, this is debatable. But at least this one, I find it crazy. So definitely, we should call for such an institutional setup. We were really disappointed that in the June-July Council and European Summit, the European Stabilization Function has been abandoned and put within the MFF, not as an indebtedness capacity, but as a normal credit line for competitiveness and structural reform, because it's within the reform support program. Now I'm just referring to structural reform. Again, sorry to say to the Commission, don't call it structural reform. Don't call them structural reform. Mention what you want. If now we have something quite good for structural reform, there is a wish to have a directive on minimum wages in the European Union. I'm not saying that the trade union, we like the idea, okay. It's difficult for us because all the union and social partners are not working the same in the European Union. However, this is the kind of structural reform, if they are written down, we can support. If you are telling us structural reform is needed, look, it's not even me, it's our colleague who's an economist this morning who said it is the labor who pays the costs. And we paid the cost heavily. So structural reforms, don't call it structural reform, call it tax harmonization, call it social harmonization, call it a fight against tax avoidance, all this, but not structural reform. And also, if I'm speaking about social partner, etc., collective bargaining in the last 10 years, which is really important and which has to be developed much further in Eastern and Central country. Collective bargaining coverage has been decreasing in the last 10 years. So in the austerity period, if I could say, as part of the program. I will finish by saying that I really enjoy that we have now strong figures on where we are on convergence. Our colleague from DG ECFIN touched upon some determinants of convergence, and I think we need to work much more on that. I'm just saying an example where, for example, James and I wouldn't agree, is about productivity. We agree together, yeah, it's good to have productivity, but we do not have at all the same solution for increasing productivity. So that is the kind of stuff we would like to debate. We spoke about political ownership, but I think it has to do with structural reform, which I mentioned just before. We have also, as part of the semester process, a trade union involvement index, and it shows very well that we have some trouble to establish strong collective bargaining or social dialogue in some member states, and it's quite regular, and the improvement is taking place at a slow pace. Again, I'm not saying that we should all act the same in every member state. However, there should be some places for debating social issues and business issues at sectoral level for us, because we do think that sectoral and national collective bargaining are much more resilient to a crisis. And I finish by saying that I said that market-driven solutions are not the best in our mind. We are saying that we are recovering. I'd just like to say that the total hours worked in the European Union is just back to the 2008 level this year. So employment is much better, unemployment is much better, But if you look at the total total hours worked in the European Union, it's exactly the same as the one which was in 2008. Therefore, it means that some employment are bad quality jobs, and this remains a very important topic. I'm saying it because we spoke about poverty, but I'd like to raise the issue of in-work poverty, which is still 1 percentage point above its 2008 level. So we still have some trouble. And I'm now finishing on green transition. I cannot more agree with you that we need some differentiated investment programs, but we need also globally, on the European level, a full change of view on our productive system. And for that, the unions will be ready to do all the job they can do for training and retraining and educating and skilling and all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all. Comments, queries from the floor? Oh. There's one here, sorry. Sorry.
Yes, I just wanted to thank your exposés and your views that you expressed here, and this is of course very valuable. On the productivity issue, you have a good point that of course the views of the employees and employers might diverge, but just looking at the micro level, what makes a firm or an individual working in a firm more productive is also the willingness to change and to learn new things, to have new skills, to adopt new technology. Not every one of us, we have to face the truth, is as willing as others to do so. And so some element of inequality in this will prevail. The point is that we should help those that are less willing and maybe less able for one or another reason to also manage to increase their productivity. And this is a lot of this is really micro policy. So at the level of a person, at the level of a household, at the level of a firm. So basically that was my observation on productivity.
Thank you. Any further? The gentleman at the back there. I got two mics, good.
My question relates to the intervention of the director of Business Europe. I fully agree with your argument on labor mobility. It's a factor of adjustment in a monetary union in a country. My question is, to what extent, whether there are not limits to that. I will explain very briefly. If you bring it too far, you have some obvious problems in some areas like the population, like rural areas where the basic services are not there and so on. But my point there is that to what extent some part of labor mobility is not free riding, in the sense that, and this connects to the Green Deal, let's say the business and that industries that are benefiting from this labor mobility are not paying the externalities they are creating. So the Green Deal is about that. It's about a number of negative externalities like mostly environmental, air pollution, which means number of people who dies, diseases that have to be paid by the health system, and so on. Somehow, until now, these business industries are free riding. So this labor mobility is not incorporating the cost that increasing congestion is creating for the whole society. It's a burden that is being supported by the whole society, but that is being created by the increasing concentration of business or economic activity in specific places with negative consequences for the whole society, so negative externalities that until now had been put into the whole society. So my point is there a limit to labor mobility as a factor of adjustment or not? And this is, to me, very much connected with the Green Deal. The Green Deal is somehow what says is it's time to internalize the negative externalities that the increasing concentration of economic activity has been creating. And it has been hitting to us too much, and it's a time to put a limit to that. Thank you.
Further comments? I'll gather a few more. That's for you, James. That's why people are reflecting. Perhaps, James, would you like to respond to the
I'll come back on that. I think it's a good point you raise. I hope I was clear when when I said that there should be some labour mobility. So I wouldn't certainly disagree that you're right. There may well be limits to how much labour mobility we want to see. That may be political. I think my point was that there needs to be some labour mobility as part of the response. Just on your points about the Green Deal, I would. Again, it's not an area I'm expert on. I would fully support your points. I think, bringing in the externalities, making sure they're accounted for. It does occur to me when you're talking, though, that actually, is it necessarily going to be negative for the environment if people move into cities? So if you're able to walk to work, if you're able to get to the metro, isn't that going to be more positive than if you're living in a rural area and you have a long way to drive to work? So, we need a proper debate about this. I think, yes, you're right. We need to make sure those externalities are accounted for, and then we can start building policy. But I'm not an expert.
Maybe just following up on this this issue. You mentioned these enormous environmental challenges in the transition to the low-carbon economy that we have set ourselves. Have you yourselves in Regio done some calculations on what type of regions is it that will be required to do this? Are they low growth regions, or can you?
Well, what you have probably seen is indeed that the Commission President-elect, Mrs. von der Leyen, has proposed to accompany the European Green Deal with a large-scale investment program, which should also comprise a new fund, which has been labeled Just Transition Fund. And this Just Transition Fund is particularly focused, or shall be focused, on those places and citizens who will be particularly affected by this transition. I mentioned already one, let's say, group of citizens and as I said, probably group of regions, because it's somehow linked, is the coal mines, because we expect obviously that many of these coal mines will be closed in the years to come. I mean, that member states have put forward national energy and climate plans where they have obliged themselves to reduce, in particular, CO2 emissions over the next 10 years. This brings me, in fact, to the second group of regions or places which we see which may be affected. These are those which rely very much on high carbon intensive industries, so emitting basically a lot of CO2, where obviously we would hope that there would be a natural transition in terms of by innovation, so that you move, for example, from burning coal to more sustainable ways of, for example, electricity production or so. But still, we also believe that, given the fact that these regions and companies will have to adjust over the next years, that these may be places, and as I said, also then obviously the workforce working in these places, which will be affected. But we have not yet, this is still a bit where we wait, obviously, for the next college to take office to tell us exactly what the expectations are. In terms of coverage, which regions should be covered, because obviously you can start going back to my coal example from coal, and you can enlarge it to peat. Those of you who come from Ireland know that the Irish, they do not have any problems in terms of coal, but they do have still peat, and there's also still peat production. This is, I think, as dangerous, if I may say so, in terms of CO2 emissions as coal. You have obviously oil shale. So once again, the question is a bit, what is the ambition, the level of ambition, which needs to be factored in also then obviously in the broader discussions about the future EU budget, because as you know, we have always these two camps, the net payers who probably want to limit it as far as possible, and on the other side, the big beneficiaries from the EU budget. And once again, we do not know, when this discussion will be settled and decided. And we also don't know yet exactly what the level of ambition will be. But I think this is probably a bit, like what we are thinking about in terms of who would be the addressees of such investments.
I understand that. Is it decided yet that this is to be a regional-based activity, or is it sectoral, or is it to be focused on regions? I
would, if I knew, I would tell you, honestly. But I honestly do not know. The only thing which I can say is, depending on the size of the fund, and depending, obviously, you will need to answer the question, you want to have an impact. And we know that these transitions, I mean, you just need to look around in Belgium. You have a part of Belgium which is still going through a very painful transition from coal and steel to hopefully more modern-based economy. This takes obviously time. It takes a lot of investment, and once again, I mean, I would assume depending on the size of the whole investment budget, we would then also need to see how limited we would and how focused we would need to be. But we don't know yet. No.
Okay. Any comments from the floor? Any further reflections from the panelists?
Just one point about training, as you mentioned. I fully agree with your point, but we have an additional problem into that, and it goes with what you said, is very often it is the most educated we get the most training. And this also we have to be very careful, because if we want everybody to get the right skills, we need also to make those people who are not really used to get access to training properly. And my second remark is on what you said, but I think your question reflected exactly where we are when dealing with a Green Deal, or call it the way you want, the transformation, just transition, so etc. It's one stuff to look at the environment and the productive system, if you could say, but we have also to be careful, since we are speaking here about convergence, that we are not going to give the whole amount of money to those regions which are already rich, and those who have nothing will get nothing. In which case, we will perhaps do something on the green side, but nothing on the convergence issue.
Just one point. Can I just
Sure.
add one? Yeah, I mean, I'm getting obsessed with this in-work poverty indicator, but we shouldn't forget, just on a technical point, we shouldn't forget that when we look at in-work poverty, that population has changed dramatically. Yeah? If you take the people in work 7 years ago, we've created whatever it is, 10 million jobs in the last 7 years. So you have massively changed that population. You have increased massively the numbers of people. You've taken households that were out of work, you put them into work, and they've come into that population. You've changed the population. So, you know, it's disappointing that it's gone up, and we need to do more to address that. But given that you have so massively brought people from unemployment who had a much higher possibility of being in poverty and put that into that different population, you know, it's not entirely surprising that there has been some forces that have brought that up, and we should bear that in mind when we think about that change over time.
I agree, but it's also our job as union to ensure that when you work, you have enough money to have a decent life.
Just a reflection I've had, and maybe it's more to yourself, that you speak, we've looking at the context of convergence in the European Monetary Union. You spoke about the importance of some structural reforms or specific reforms that go under that umbrella. You did not mention anything about completing the single market. Okay, there's some reference in an earlier version of your slides anyway to digital and so on. And of course, this issue of whether a further completion or full completion of the single market really leads to more convergence or not. I think that the founding fathers knew exactly what they were doing when we created the single market, that it would generally lift a lot of countries, but there were regional disparities already in the Treaty of Rome. We sort of spoke about that. I just wonder that what is the latest edition of The Economist. I don't know if you saw it. It's the forgotten issue, completing the single market, and they showed some data that was actually really quite interesting. In that they looked at price divergence or price convergence, which is if you have really a single market, you have one price, and that from about the start of the millennium up until 2008, you have price convergence, more and more movement towards a single market, if you believe that indicator. And I guess theoretically it's the best indicator you can get. But then since then, it's been totally flat. That there has been no, since 2008, okay, a lot of things have been going on. 2008 was a rather special year, but it's been flat. Does ECFIN have some sort of... why did you not write completing the single market as a part of convergence? Do you think it's dangerous? It's problematic?
Well, actually,
Exactly, I had it there on the slide that was talking about pools. It's exactly the single market elements, completing the single market. Perhaps it was not very well accentuated there, but indeed, of course, this is, we are guiding by principles, indeed, as you said, that were created 50 or around 50 years ago, ever closer union. So basically, this also means creating a market that is one price. There is transparency in prices, people can compare, no exchange rates, no borders for movement of the productive factors. Obviously, this is a very important element. Maybe I had quite a lot of slides, as you mentioned, so this one was somewhere there, of course, as well. And I'm glad that you're going to publish them afterwards, so people can actually take a look afterwards.
Okay. Any further comments and questions? If not, then I would thank the panelists very much. Please remain where you are. Thank you all very much indeed. And to close, I would like my director to say a few words. Juan.
Thank you, Donald. I'm very happy that you wrote in the program closing remarks and not concluding remarks, because I don't intend to try to conclude anything or to repeat things that they have been said, not even the last words about the ever close union, because, you know, even you have some people, they have questions on that, or how close. But maybe to mention, this is I'm very happy that we organized this event. I think it is many people in the European Union and the different bodies. We are working in this field, and it's very important that we share and put together the different information and the different research and evidence that we are providing. It's only when we do that that we can see how we complement each other, and we can get never a perfect picture, but a better understanding on how things are evolving and where the policy focus has to be. We hope that we will continue to do some additional work. As a matter of fact, we are currently discussing our management board the next 4-year program, and two big thematic focus will be in that work program for us for the upcoming years. One will be about the impact on change, building in some work that we have done on digitalization, but with a stronger element of the transition to a low-carbon economy. And the other one is building on this work on convergence, but expanding to a broader area of social cohesion, the glue in the society, which elements that help the people to feel that they are part of the same community, of the same project. And so we will continue to do some monitoring work on different dimensions on convergence, but we want to look more closely also at elements of social cohesion within societies, with the regional dimension, certainly, that will be there. And trying to understand there which part of this cohesion is really linked to some material facts or evidence that you can see in indicators, which part is not. It is coming from other factors, other perceptions, it was said. Fairness, the concept of fairness, how this can be measured. Okay, we have, you know, as you know, some of our surveys, the European Quality of Life Survey, the European Working Survey as well has a number of subjective indicators, the European Quality of Life as well, and how people live and perceive their reality. And that is linked, as mentioned in some of the panels, is, I think Masi highlighted, very much linked to the trust and the support on any project, including the European Union or the European integration project. What is in it for us? How these guys are trying to help me to become better. So the more that we're exposed now with in the era of internet and access to full information, the more that we see how others are having their lives, the more that we want to be upwards, converging towards what we see in YouTube or in any social media, and certainly our work will continue here. So I want just to thank you, all the colleagues, starting with DG Employment, and but also DG Regio and all the guests from social partners, and the different speakers in the morning. Thank you very much for your attendance. I understand Cristina confirmed that the web stream will be also available for if you want some colleagues, or you couldn't follow everything, that you can maybe watch to some parts. I will do it for the first part because I arrived a bit late, and the slides will be there and some additional information. And you can also download the latest report that Marcy was leading that was just published. Thank you very much. And now I think you can join for a light lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.